Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As you're probably aware, we've been talking a lot about technology and specifically connectivity this year. Not that it's been really worth the price paid, but one positive thing, I guess, resulting from the pandemic is that some organizations have actually had time to explore technology solutions for their businesses. It's hard to do that when you're, in the throes of running your business. Travel, and particularly the inbound travel sector, has changed pretty dramatically with tech innovations in recent years. And some of those changes, like direct booking and connectivity, have left some companies feeling threatened by the rapid tech advancements. Because both of those, because it requires both investment and also the fact that connectivity can be conflated with travel distribution, it can be intimidating. Although interdependent, they are not the same. Connectivity and interoperability can indeed be a benefit to any size company for efficiencies and new business opportunities. And we're going to hear some of those opportunities today. Certainly coming out of this year, we will all need both. Even before the coronavirus, IITA leadership recognized the need to provide education to help people become more comfortable with technology trends. And that led us to an awareness of the benefits of open source standards. And thus that led us to Open Travel Alliance. IITA and Open Travel established a partnership earlier this year at the summit. Many of you were there to see that partnership launch. And the partnership is to offer education to the industry and to support the development of open standards for tour operators and travel companies. Jeff ErnstFriedman is the Executive Director of the Open Travel Alliance and a member of our Technology Task Force. He has brought together our distinguished panel today for a very interesting discussion about what's happening in technology broadly, and more specifically, our evolving post-pandemic travel industry. Jeff will moderate the session, and our panelists today include Greg Land, Distinguished Industry Leader in Travel and Transportation for IBM, Stu Waldron, Chief Technical Advisor of Open Travel Alliance, and Ken Lane, Chief Evangelist at Postman. Thank you all for your time today and for sharing your expertise with us today. We're going to learn a lot. I know that from our session earlier. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to IITA. As Lisa said, our journey started in February with this connectivity conversation. So we can honestly say that IITA is ahead of the game as the COVID pandemic came up in March. So measured in weeks, but we're definitely far out front. So as this conversation has evolved, as the technology and the transportation world is kind of disrupted, it went from a series of what is going to happen when, and now that we're on the cusp of vaccines being rolled out in the UK, I believe it's earlier today was the first public non-trial vaccine. We're now going to look into a world of, so what's next? And so as we step into this conversation, brought together a group of people who can help us paint a picture of what technology, connectivity, and travel standards will look like, and what the role that each of us will play and the opportunities that go into it. So I want to kick off the conversation with Greg Land of IBM. It really is to give us, if you could kind of give us a quick rewind of what the last 9 to 10 months would look like in the travel industry. We'll tip off to that as a broad perspective. We'll dip down to Stu talking about what are the challenges that were inherent in the connectivity world. And then we'll lead the conversation on to Ken. We'll talk about what are standards broadly outside of travel and health industry and financial services. And now that we're seeing those explicitly connected with COVID, we'll kind of loop back again to what is the technology enhancements that we're seeing with WTTC's seamless traveler journey, and what is the near future, and go from there. So Greg, if you could kick us off, give a quick intro of you and your role with IBM in the industry and how far back you go, and talk about where are we right now as we at the first week of December.
Okay, thanks Jeff, and thanks Lisa. Glad to be here. So I lead globally for IBM our segment around aviation, hospitality, and travel related services. So that involves airlines, airports, hotels, car rental, cruise line, as well as all the intermediaries, GDSs, travel management companies, tour operators, and online travel agencies. So it gives me a really great purview of what's going on across the broad spectrum of the industry. So prior to IBM, I actually spent 7 years at American Airlines, 11 years at Sabre, and then ran global sales for Wyndham Hotel Group for 5 years. So kind of a meandering path through the travel world, but it all serves me well today with what I do at IBM. And I also am a board member of Open Travel Alliance and represent IBM on Jeff's board. So work a lot with him on some of what we're going to talk about today. Now, let's rewind to pre-pandemic. You know, pre-pandemic, everybody was investing heavily in digital transformation. And when you look at most travel providers, that was two-pronged. It was to digitize everything for a direct distribution strategy. And that was also about not only cutting cost out of the supply chain, but also about getting access to the data. So travel providers did that to draw you to their website, their mobile app to book everything so that they got full access to your data. And that was important for them to better understand who their customer was and to gain information to personalize the service, but also for follow-up marketing, to be honest. Now, we also saw a lot of work progressing towards open standards around data for that very reason. So we wanted to start streamlining processes, both on the sales and marketing side, as well as on the service side. And a lot of that was leading towards efforts that we'll talk about a little bit later to really kind of streamline the entire travel journey and start leveraging things like biometrics to expedite lines at airports or boarding cruise ships and things like that. So we'll talk about kind of where that has come since the pandemic. But then also prior to the pandemic, you know, we saw heavy mobile adoption. Travelers are, you know, inherently mobile. A lot of the employees in the travel industry are inherently mobile. So both on the consumer side and the employee side, we saw a great, you know, acceleration of mobile adoption. 87% of all travelers have a smartphone. And I think the airlines got the early start on this. And because of that, they see adoption of 85% or more on their mobile apps. I mean, anybody who travels even just a couple of times a year, you know, are comfortable doing mobile check-in, using mobile boarding passes, picking their own seat, and even reaccommodating themselves in some of the mobile applications for airlines. Now with hotels and cruise lines and others, that's 25% or less. And many of the cruise lines and tour operators don't even have a mobile app today. And I'll tell you why that's important here in a second for how we progress post-pandemic. Now, when the pandemic hit, we saw retail and food and beverage companies react very quickly. You saw them all roll out expanded mobile and web applications to allow for contactless ordering, curbside pickup, and it allowed a lot of them to continue operating and stay afloat through the early days of the pandemic. The antithesis of that is most travel providers, because of travel restrictions and, you know, so many places going into lockdown, they went more into crisis mode. It was about cash preservation, rethinking their staffing. So we saw a slightly different approach in travel than what we saw in retail and food and beverages. But then it was probably late May, we started seeing a lot of the travel companies start pivoting and thinking about recovery. And we did see a little bit of a blip over the summer. You know, hotels saw some business come back. We saw some occupancy jump up, especially with resorts and areas that had private beaches and things like that for the summer. But it definitely was leisure travel that came back first. And most of what we saw over the summer was a rebound in the drive market and mostly domestic travel, 5-hour radius drive mostly. And so we saw waves of travelers, what we call the phase one travelers, what we saw come back this summer. And those tended to be folks who were very comfortable with a brand, very loyal with a brand, comfortable directly engaging with them through their self-service technology. And so those that did have mobile apps and robust websites out there benefited from that. Now, the big focus as everybody started pivoting was, of course, on restoring trust with the traveler. So you saw the first focus on cleaning and sanitization protocols, but then they quickly moved towards contactless travel. And if you've seen any of the interviews, especially with hotel companies and cruise lines, they all talk about how travel will come back when their contactless technology catches up. So those that did have mobile apps in place and already started getting some adoption trends with their mobile apps for shopping and booking, and even with the service aspects of their delivery, they're the ones that are going to see that come back very quickly. So that's going to be important. Now, when I talk about the consumer behavior, this is where data is going to become important. You probably all have profiles and data on your repeat customers, but don't rely too heavily on the past trends. We're going to see the consumer behavior for travel change drastically. How they shop, what they buy, where they travel, and how much and what they're willing to pay a premium for, all that's going to change. So what we're telling most of our clients across all subsegments of travel is you kind of have to set the reset button and really monitor the trends, because it's going to evolve quickly. We're going to see the phase 1 traveler extend to the phase 2, the phase 3, and then the business traveler. So just know that you might need to rethink some of your sales and marketing tactics, and also rethink how you use technology in that area as well. You'll hear the word brand-to-brand APIs or brand-to-brand connections. You're going to see a lot of new partnerships form. And with the way that you guys put together a lot of your inbound tours across multiple suppliers, it's definitely something that you guys need to understand and know how to leverage in your business. And Stu and Jeff will talk a little bit more about open standards and APIs and how it affects that. But just those types of deeper partnerships are going to become very important for how trips are put together. Consumers are going to want to be able to contact one person and put together that trip. I'll talk about the health aspects a little bit later, Jeff, when we circle back on the WTTC initiatives.
Thanks, Greg. And I think, so one of the questions that you brought, or the statements you brought up, is that air has this and hotel and others don't. So Stu, how come if one technology has it, if I can already do it with my phone on one end, how come I just can't have it on the other? Like, why is it so complicated when the features clearly exist somewhere?
Because we can. So to give everybody a little bit of background, airlines really led any-to-any connectivity. Every airline in the world more or less connected with any other airline in the world, because even as early as the 50s, they had to coordinate on connecting flights. So they got very adept at exchanging passenger information, fare information, and then also in retail, what makes airlines really just weird is tickets are printed money. In the old days when they were printed tickets, you had a printing press there, you were printing money because those could be redeemed for cash. And even e-tickets today are still just printed money sitting on a database. But because you have gates at airports and you have to do the validations and stuff like that, to answer your question, Jeff, that led very quickly into the apps and other things to go ahead and get the boarding process, more fluid, to cut down the congestion in airports. There was a driving need for time and space and everything else. Whereas checking into a hotel on an app is a convenience feature, it almost gets mandatory in an airline, because in an airline, you have to validate who's actually getting on the plane. So those additional government requirements really drove them to the apps and other things faster, along with the retail and marketing advantages it gave them. But airlines have done a good job over the years of coming to agreements on how to exchange information, if also for no other reason than they share airport space. You may go in Atlanta where Delta is dominant, but Delta flies to Beijing. Delta flies, to other countries where somebody else runs the airport, and they have to learn to exchange all this information. So their movement into the digital space in that aspect was very reasonable and almost more mandatory if they were going to be able to do better at the airports and boarding people and keeping things secure. On the whole, just also then now to move that into where we are as an industry on talking to each other. Airlines again had the early advantage and set a lot of standards that got automated in the 1970s. I started at Eastern Airlines in '77 when it was all still kind of new and cool, not so much anymore. But again, every airline had financial reasons to talk to any other airline, and we had to exchange this information. That type of the way of talking was beginning to be adopted by hotels and car rental agencies because they wanted to have attachment rates to airline seats. And distribution companies like Sabre, like Travelport, like Amadeus started coming up and everything to pull together information at the trip layer, but everybody still pretty much had to talk like they were an airline. Now things are opening up a bit. A lot of what I tend to refer to as the travel suppliers are moving into more of a digital retail mode, which is great, but they're modernizing basically their private channel because that's what they can move on first. A lot of hotel chains, for example, are going to be moving away. Some already are on, trip type incentives. To say, okay, you're a good customer because you had so many nights at my hotel or whatever, just those type of rewards programs, they're moving completely to personalization to say, I know what I need to do for this customer and when based on, I know in my systems what their value is to me. So it's moving to a whole different form of retail, but there's not a lot going on to how to do that across travel suppliers. So for example, at Open Travel, we started putting out XML messages around Y2K, 2001, and we put out XML messages for just about anything you can imagine related to travel. Airline, air traffic, hotel traffic, car rental traffic, but golf tee times, restaurants, anything, pretty much you name it, there's an OTA message for that. But everybody has modified those messages. So even in our attempts to set those standards, some of the base construct of the message is recognizable, but they use different things in the message to mean different things privately to meet what their retailing model is. So this is adding to what is seen, and Kim may talk about it a little bit, an API chaos and differentiation out there. A lot of people, including tour operators and other smaller, let's call it suppliers, are getting online and they have their websites, but there's just no consistency in how they're doing it. There are some growing middle tier suppliers, there are consolidators that are providing services to the tour operators and others to get them online and get their content published, but each one of those is unique. So if you back up to who in this supply chain is pulling together a journey, so pulling together a travel experience. I want to go diving somewhere. I want to go hiking somewhere. I want to see a Broadway show. Everybody wants to see travel retail go more to experience-led aspects, but pulling all the actual air travel and where to stay and the ground transportation and B&Bs and everything else, we're facing an API chaos problem because the data is out there, but the IT costs to pull it together has gotten prohibitive. That's the main barrier to entry to a tour operator or anybody who wants to publish their product with their terms and conditions and fares set to it. That's the daunting task. That, let's say, even a boutique hotel in Manhattan with maybe 50 rooms, they have a very hard time getting picked up by major distribution chains, because if I have to talk to their PMS system and it's a one-off, if I'm a big distributor, it's like, it's not worth the time to sell maybe a room or two a month. So as we're looking at open travel going forward, we're looking at a different look at standards. We're looking at data definitions, everything to say a station is a station is a station. In-suite means in-suite, between rooms, and we have some consistency. Technology is going to allow us to have some differences in the message structure and how the messages are put together. That's actually not that big of a problem anymore. But it's consistency also in action. So when we all say we're going to publish APIs to publish my product, and so people on any channel through any app can consume my product, we also going to have some consistency in behaviors, that it provides a product description, it provides a price, it provides the terms and conditions in a way where those can be processed at the channel level. It's going to have to be, how do you know what's the next thing to do, whether you need to pay now or you can further modify before you pay. So that's the kind of standards we're working with everybody, and would enjoy any help from anybody on the call in setting that direction and setting down those standards to say, what's the minimum we have to define to provide some predictability and how people publish their travel products. Because predictability will allow a greater number of people to automate, bring in the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to, at large scale, put together traveler experiences. So that's where we fit in as the Open Travel Alliance. We're trying to get some consistency and predictability on how people publish their product. And in order to bring down the price of publishing, bring down the price of consuming, and get more people in there with the automated or artificial intelligence and automation things to try that and provide that experience-led retailing. So we think there's a lot in here for everybody, and can answer any questions, everything about how that would work.
Thanks. So as we see the need for travel standards and how the individual traveler will, they book a hotel, air, et cetera, at the same time, and they know they're the same person on the same trip. We understand the extent for standards. With COVID, we're now seeing the introduction of health data as well to be looped in. We're going to, will there be, how are we going to flag individual travelers who have crossed a certain threshold that they are safe to travel, and et cetera. So Kin has worked on a number of standards kind of brought back from in the past few decades, and then also stuff you've worked on currently with PSD2 and other. So if you could share with us broadly of what does it look like to bring about a set of standards, and what are the requirements, and then you could dip that into your experience with API tool creation and working with the different API formats of why sometimes there's a need for multiple API standards because they do certain things. I know Postman had an announcement with async API and how it serves a different purpose with another standard. So if you kind of show it's not a single standard to do everything all the time, but to solve a certain problem.
Sure. So thanks for having me. So let me kind of zoom out. So I'm not a travel expert. I'm an API expert. That's what I focus on in standards. So the problem you're all facing is fairly universal across multiple industries right now. And what you guys talk about, mobile is kind of the center of your universe, and that not just the connectivity that's reflected there, but the interoperability that's required when you're traveling the globe or doing business around the globe, and you're having to connect to many different systems or aggregate and orchestrate across many different systems. So this is something that's being felt in all industries. But to back up, how did we get here? I mean, APIs are not any new vendor tech solution. They're just the next iteration of the web. So websites are very much returning HTML for human beings that can be rendered in the browser. And then once mobile phones came about in 2007, 8, 9, APIs started delivering all of those resources that we find on our mobile phones. And prior to that, there's several kind of different API movements. There's the service-oriented architecture, or SOA, which is a very enterprise. But new players like Amazon, eBay, Salesforce were playing with web APIs and using HTTP because it's low cost. It's a lot cheaper to operate, and you're already doing it. You're doing the web. It's cheap to kind of lay on this layer that's meant for delivering data to multiple channels. And then by the time mobile phones came out, the cloud had already started taking hold at Amazon, and we started seeing delivering APIs for anything you needed on web as well as your mobile properties. And so why are APIs important? Because one, you can use this low cost infrastructure you're already using for your websites. You can define all of your resources. So your payments, your hotels, your all individual resources can be defined as simple APIs that are accessible publicly or privately. But then also it's those capabilities that those resources enable. So it's the actions you can take on that. It's the bookings, it's the downloads, it's those different things that you can do. Those are also defined as APIs. So you just end up with this whole buffet of resources and capabilities that you can put into motion, and you can deliver web apps, mobile apps, and you can integrate with other partners and third-party developers. But as Stu mentioned, you end up with a lot of chaos in that situation, especially at an industry level. And so what you all are experiencing in this is pretty common, and really the largest and the most heavily regulated and global industries are dealing with this pain right now. And a couple examples start with healthcare, and this overlaps a lot with what's been talked about with the travel industry. Is there's in the US, there's what's called the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, or the FHIR specification. And so it's a next generation of an older SOA, service-oriented architecture standard, XML standard, but now it's being kind of reborn for this new generation. And I work with the Open API initiative to help provide an open API. So Open API is a specification you can describe any API in. I'm using it, we're using it as part of the FHIR to describe healthcare interoperability. Secondarily, you hear a lot of conversations in Europe around PSD2. That's for banking standards. If you're a bank in the UK or in the EU, you have to use PSD2 for your payments, for your credit card accounts, your bank accounts, your ATM locators. They all the banks use the same API design, and the same schema standards. So a payment means a payment means a payment, no matter what bank you're at. Same for healthcare in this country. PSD2 or FHIR specification is really helping kind of standardize what is a patient's record. What does it look like when it's exchanged from one system? It remains the same unit of representation, or the same object. And that's what really, those kind of standards is what helps this type of interoperability. And we see other places this is taking hold. You see it with municipalities. There's the 211 and the 311 city standards. So we all know 911 emergencies. 211 is how you find health and human services in a city, how you find a food bank, how you find a healthcare clinic. 311 is how you report non-emergency events. And so there's standards bodies for each of those trying to push forward interoperability between cities, so that a 311 system in Berlin is the same 311 system when you're in New York or Chicago. And that really reduces the friction when it comes to delivering applications, mobile applications, and delivering interoperability and integrations. So we all speak a common vocabulary. I mean, think of what English does, to the global travel market. That's the same when it comes to Open API. And then you mentioned, Jeff's async API. All async API is a sister specification to Open API that describes event-driven, message-driven, and more real-time APIs, where Open API is describing your basic HTTP or RESTful API. And so those standards are being used across many industries to help make sure that everyone's speaking the same language, using the same vocabulary. So when we reference a room or an activity or anything, it's the same. It means the same. I can take this representation of this hotel room and pass it around, and it means the same in every system that it's in. And it's just really critical to help make sure we're all on the same page. There's interoperability between systems. And then the cost, as Stu mentioned, the overall IT cost of operating and then developing applications goes way down. And then we can all really focus on what we do best in that kind of environment.
Can you also touch on really what motivates an API developer? Some of the representatives on this call will be for companies that will approach developers to say, this is what I need to be done. They're approaching technologists who are not experts in the industry, but they don't need to be, because that is what the role of the membership of IITA is already. That they don't need to. They're already providing that expertise. So in these data type standards components here, what does it make it easier for them to develop, and how does that relate to a reduced cost aspect? Why is it making it easier on that end, making it better for the, in this case, the consumer on our end.
Yeah, so every API resource or capability that gets defined, you can define it as an open API. And think of that open API specification as a contract. So it's a business contract. Here's what I mean by this resource or this capability. And the benefits of standards efforts like open travel is you're standardizing that contract to mean something in a business sense, as well as it is machine readable and it can be used in a variety of modern tooling. So Open API is supported by Microsoft Azure, AWS, Google, IBM, all the major players, Salesforce, all are using Open API as a contract for these digital resources and capabilities. So when you hand someone a contract, you can hand it to a technical person who may not quite understand all the nuances of your business. Because I know enough about the travel industry. Y'all got a bunch of nuances and little details that I just don't understand or get as a technical person. And so if that's baked into the contract and I can just fire up a gateway, fire up a database, do what I do best, scale it, and then when that API is functioning, it speaks just like that contract dictated it should speak. It's got its T's crossed, its I's dotted exactly as that contract says. And there's ways that we can have tests that audit that. So with each release, we make sure it's always adhering to the contract, test-driven contract API development. And then that contract can speak throughout the lifecycle, and all the tools I use as an architect. I can document the API with it to share with other people. I can deploy it to a gateway. I can generate code in a variety of programming languages for use in mobile or web apps. I can secure it. I can test it. All the life cycle of service providers and tooling providers have are supporting Open API now and Async API to do what they do. So you can use a mix of these services and tools with one contract and get all of this done. And for me as a technologist, I don't have to worry about all the nuance of your business and your domain, your industry. And having that added layer that open travel is like going around and doing all of that work to get consensus and agreement at a business level, as well as at a technical level. And then I'm a mobile developer, I'm an API developer. You just give me that meaningful contract. You save me so much time and energy and friction along the way. And you're going to save costs and energy throughout the life cycle at every stop.
Thank you. So Stu, I saw you put it into the chat, but I wanted to expand on the question was really what Ken was saying with the challenges that are out there. Can you bring a little bit more specific examples, really with your history with Travelport and before? There's all of this stuff coming in at you in different ways. And so there's a role to stitching it together, but we don't necessarily have to wait for a unified single standard, because as we're seeing, there won't ever be a single place for everything. There'll be a financial services PSD2, and that's just with the EU. There could be a number of them. FHIR, which Ken spoke to, is in the United States, probably won't be elsewhere as well. There's tooling that can kind of bridge that gap in the meantime, but also bringing those all together. What are the inherent challenges, and bringing on the next one, what is the extra effort that we see there?
So as an example, the global distribution systems like Travelport, Sabre, and Amadeus, they have large IT staffs, sometimes as many as 2,000 people. And what a large group of them do is what you would affectionately call the normalization of the messages they're pulling, what they're pulling from the airlines, the car rentals, the hotels, the cruise lines, everybody else. And that again represents this large IT cost just to acquire travel products, to put in a retail channel. As we adopt the newer standards, what this just allows is increasing availability of product, particularly from smaller providers with not large IT staffs, and lowering the prices for even the distributors themselves, as again, there's less specialization, less bespoke messages to deal with. But to your point, Jeff, there are people out there of distribution systems and consolidators that's their business model today, is basically the normalization of this content. So that also still provides a bridge to moving forward. Just what people will see is that as they adopt some of the newer technology, and again, I'll use the terms offers and orders. What we're trying to do in travel is get to a similar concept of offers and orders that's in retail everywhere else, like in Amazon, eBay, and other things. The thing Ken was talking about, there's offer and order management systems out there that actually could handle the majority of what happens in travel. We're not that different. It's just we made it different from our starting point back in the 60s and the 70s. So what that means is, as people have new offers to be posted, there'll be at first a limited number of distributors and channels will pick it up, but that'll gradually increase. But that doesn't mean they can't use the existing distributors and consolidators. And I would expect actually the consolidators out there today will end up being some of the people that start specializing in aggregation of offers, again, to a triple level experience or, a destination level type experience. So, there are multiple paths to get there, but this is going to be a bit of a transition in the industry led by a lot of what we talked about. Personalization, a lot of what Ken talked about and we talked about before and Greg talked about is personalization is a big thing. So when it comes to security, yes, we also need to do at post-COVID and everything, the personal identification to understand medical type information. But if personalization is going to work, we may have 4 or 5 or 6 providers that need to know they're talking about the same John Smith on Peachtree Street in Atlanta. So that's going to be some of the early advances with the help of the WTTC and others, is this ability to have a shared identity. And that's another path to gradual adoption, is probably what we'll see these new standards use first, is people who are leading the charge on personalization, but they want personalization to go farther than their private website, their private channel, their private app on the phone. And so it's a little unpredictable who's going to move forward first on this, but I do want everybody to understand this isn't a situation where to get anything done, we have to wait till a critical mass of people are capable of producing new messages. That won't work. That's never worked. So there will be a phasing in of different capabilities, and I predict particularly around the shop aspect for people to just get their products published out there. And then if their product is selected, for some time drop into the existing means, whether that even means dropping to the private website to actual finish the purchase and payment and everything else. But yes, we all collectively have to find ways to phase this in, because there's no build it and they will come. This has to show value immediately to people.
So we're seeing this transition now immediately. Greg, if you can kind of touch on to what are we starting to see the last few weeks and what we're going to see going forward. We talked about some of the changes to the cruise industry and some of the changes they've had to make near term and what they're going to do long term, and what are the, with the WTTC and the seamless traveler journey and the connections there, and how it's going to, help guide us through what are we going to see in the next few months into the years as we start to roll out of this
Sure.
of the pandemic.
Yeah, sure. So I also represent IBM with the World Travel and Tourism Council, and Open Travel has a close collaborative partnership with them as well. All of us have been involved in some of these task force with World Travel and Tourism Council. And if you're not familiar with them, it is a global association of all of the ministers of tourism around the world. And so it really does bring together both the public and the private sector side. And if you look at what we're going through right now to try to get people back traveling, it's got to be a tight collaboration between public and private sector. We've got things going right now where airlines are wanting to offer COVID-free flights, but some countries are still requiring a 14-day quarantine. So does it make sense to invest in testing every single person before they board an airplane if you're arriving into a country where they've yet to make the decision to release inbound travelers from a 14-day quarantine? So there's a lot of technology issues as well as government agency issues that are being addressed, but it's coming together very quickly. These are things we've been in discussions since May on kind of the travel restriction and rules and quarantine side of things and how we break through that to make people feel safe traveling again. So a lot of it is about restoring traveler trust, but a lot of it too is about restarting economies that rely heavily on tourism. But I think this aspect of it is also important for this audience, because as we look at inbound traffic to the US, and the US having some of the highest COVID numbers right now, I think having these types of testing protocols that's trackable and you're able to verify and authenticate somebody's health status upon entry to a country like the US, I think that's going to be very important as far as getting people back traveling and being able to break through some of these quarantines. And so before the pandemic, WTTC and Open Travel was collaborating on what was called the Seamless Traveler Journey. And that was very much just focused on digitizing travel credentials, digital passports, digital visa processes, but making sure everything was digitized so that we could then use mobile authentication and biometric authentication to streamline check-in points and security points. So we were already heading down this path, and then the pandemic hit. So all we had to do was add standards like what Ken just talked about for now digitizing health information and start working with governments around the world on how to build standard protocols as to the window in which you had to have a negative test to enter a particular country. So you've got a lot of countries already, Greece, Turkey, Croatia, that continued to allow inbound travelers throughout the pandemic. And they just required you to show a negative test result within the 48 hours before arrival. You had to download a contact tracing app and basically agree to be contact traced by your mobile device the whole time you were in their country. So they were able to keep some pretty good flow of inbound tourism. I have a lot of friends in Europe and the UK that went to Greece over the summer and you know, enjoyed it very much like they typically would, and even more so because lower crowds than typical. But as this moves forward, what WTTC is doing, this is now transitioned into the Safe and Seamless Traveler Journey Initiative. We're addressing the testing protocols for the time being until we have a majority of people vaccinated. And what we're starting to do now is work with government agencies like TSA, Immigration, Customs and Border Patrol, as well as with airlines and airports to get technology and procedures in place. So there's several different groups all working in collaboration on this. IATA has a travel pass. There's a nonprofit organization called Commons Project that is also collaborating with us on building out standards for this health information and how it can be authenticated for people crossing borders. And then IBM and our Watson Health organization has created the IBM Digital Health Pass, which is a blockchain platform to keep the information secure. And it basically creates a QR code on your mobile device from your test result that can be scanned by the airline or by TSA, Immigration, Customs and Border Protection to allow you entry into a country. And in a lot of countries, they're letting that mitigate your 14-day quarantine. And if you arrive with a negative test within a certain time window, they're allowing you to progress. Now, as that transitions to vaccinations, that means we're going to also have to integrate into these platforms digital immunization records as well. Now, already think about the data privacy concerns that travelers have today. You know, they're willing to share some information with you, but most people don't want to go very far. Now we're asking them to share very private medical and health information. And there are several trials around the world going on right now that look very promising. And it's just going to mean that the technology to really be able to clearly have privacy of this data is going to be important. So what most of them are doing is it authenticates your test record or your vaccine or immunization record back to the medical and healthcare side. And that's where the FHIR data standard that Ken talked about comes into play. because these all follow that FHIR standard that's used in the medical and healthcare world. But it basically looks at the entry rules for the country you're going to. It looks at the window in which your test was taken. It decides based on the tolerance of what's allowed for entering that country, if your test is still valid, and it only passes back to the airline or the cruise line or the hotel company, whoever's trying to authenticate that test result, strictly a red light or a green light. You're okay to enter or you're not. And so United is one of the airlines here in the US that has started COVID-free flights. Their first ones were between Newark Airport and London Heathrow. Those have been going now for about 2 weeks. They also started a program between San Francisco and Honolulu on October 15th, where everybody gets a rapid test before they board. And they're going to start rolling those out for all of their international hubs, Houston, Chicago, Miami, and basically start promoting these as COVID-free flights. And you have to prove a negative test result, but it's going to help reopen the borders for international travel, both outbound and inbound for the US, to have these types of flight programs. So I know American is getting ready to launch similar. I know Delta is getting ready to run a pilot program between Atlanta and Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. So that's very, very promising. And in most cases, it's blockchain technology. If you're not familiar with that, blockchain is what's being used to keep this health data secure and to only pass what's needed to allow a verification of your status. We're already starting to develop that further for vaccine and immunization records, because we're going to be in a period of transition for a while. You know, here in the US, if the general population doesn't start getting vaccinated until May or June, most of 2021, you're going to have part of the population with a vaccine and part still needing to get tested for a flight. So we're going to go through a transition period of needing both immunization records and test records to really confirm that a flight is genuinely COVID-free. And to use that information to help open borders and allow people to travel freely between countries. So all that's coming. One more thing I'll mention relative to WTTC that I find interesting. I look at this dashboard every week, but I was on a committee with WTTC where we developed a recovery dashboard, and we pulled data from 3 different sources, Google search data, forward keys data, and STR hotel data. But it basically maps by region of the world. And so it's cool because you can drill down by country and by region. You can see the airline bookings for a region, both inbound and outbound. You can see hotel occupancy levels. And then you can also see the Google travel search trends. So it's been really interesting to watch, because even the hotel and airline bookings have been slow to grow. About a month before Thanksgiving here in the US, the Google travel search shot back up to pre-COVID levels. So people are interested in looking at travel, they're Googling it. People were Googling, you know, travel restrictions, Googling, you know, holiday travel plans, but, you know, getting very anxious to travel. So it's kind of interesting to watch how the bookings flow versus that Google travel search data. And if you go to WTTC.org, on the far right side, just I'll put the link in the chat here in a second, but just go to the far right and under COVID-19, pull up recovery dashboard, and then you can click by region and different attributes. And I look at this every week because it's kind of fun to watch the trend and see how travel is coming back in different parts of the world.
There was one question that was posed about the COVID flights specifically, and the types of tests, the reliability of tests. Yeah. I think that if you can speak to the specifics of that, go ahead. But if not, sure. You know, what does it mean? Like it's kind of up in the air, and tests will, whatever tests we have today, hopefully things will improve down the road and things will change. So can you speak to just how, sure, regardless of what happens, what's the flexibility and how it lays the value of standards to making that easy to adopt?
Yeah, the program that United ran between San Francisco and Hawaii was quite limited because it was only for originating passengers. Connecting passengers weren't able to take advantage of this, but the Hawaii government agreed that anybody who got the rapid test at San Francisco Airport could break their 14-day quarantine. Now, admittedly, we know that the reliability of those rapid tests have gotten better, but it's not anywhere close to 100%. But it was one way to lower the risk of people arriving. Now, I think when you arrived, they still took your temperature and you still had to fill out a self-health survey, but it was one way to start limiting that. For these COVID-free international flights, they're expanding it to a PCR test that you take before, like 2 days before departure. And it's authenticated through a mobile app, and you have to show it on your mobile phone when you arrive at the airport. So in many cases, they are expanding this to a PCR test. You register and you get directed to a test site close to you where you live based on your zip code, and you have to go get the test done within 2 days prior to your departure. So that's one of the ways they've expanded that now, to use the more reliable PCR test. But then airlines like Etihad are testing out programs like, when you book with Etihad, they ship you a home test kit that you ship in or drop off, and you just have to do it within a time window that you have your result back at least 48 hours before your departure. So airlines are testing out all different types of programs. Right now, PCR is by far the most reliable, but the rapid tests are getting better. Now, the program that United launched from Newark to London Heathrow, the London government was not willing to mitigate the 14-day quarantine. So the compromise was, you do a rapid test at Newark Airport before departure. When you arrive at London Heathrow, you still have to quarantine for 2 days. Then you take a follow-up test. And when you get those test results back within 24 to 48 hours, then you can break quarantine. So it at least reduces it from 14-day to like 3 or 4 days, depending on how quickly the lab turns around your results. Now, inbound to the US, our Homeland Security has not made any firm decisions yet on this, but we're staying close to TSA and Department of Homeland Security, looking at, what point are they going to be willing to make some of these types of travel restrictions more manageable for inbound travel.
Thank you. Lisa, we're coming up the end of our time, so I want to tip to you to allow your opportunity to kind of ask a question that you saw from the group that came in directly, or anything you wanted to ask to us to make sure we get addressed. So I put you on the spot to,
yeah, thanks.
to come out.
Thanks, Jeff. This was a wonderful conversation, and there's so much more, I'm sure, to talk about and other questions to ask. But one that I think you just touched on, Greg, is that came to me was when you think you'll see, with all of these developments, and you said it will be happening very quickly, when do you see inbound travel to the United States, resuming? And I know you just addressed that, but is there anything else you can say to that in terms of time frame?
Well, I think with United launching their COVID-free flights, Americans trying to launch theirs in December, and Delta and KLM just started a reciprocal program. I know the timeline that United is working with to get things in place, and they expect to have all 4 of their major international hubs open with this type of protocol by mid-January. So I think there's going to be some type of working model for inbound travelers, by early next year, the January, February timeframe, which could be great for us here in the US. The one question mark is, how quickly will our government move, and the Department of Homeland Security, on allowing those types of test results to mitigate quarantines. We're kind of on a state by state basis here, right? With our quarantine policies. And so it all depends on where you're going. And if you're connecting on somewhere else, how does that change your quarantine requirements? So I think state by state, we'll start loosening those after this lockdown period we're going through right now. But I don't think we'll see the government even consider something like that until after Christmas, because we've seen surges after every major holiday where people still were anxious to get out and get together with family and groups and things. So I know they're waiting till after Christmas to make any hardened decisions here in the US for inbound travel. But I'm hoping that with these COVID-free flight protocols and everybody getting more comfortable with the testing, and we've been in touch with a lot of the labs and test facilities, and they're all getting better with their time frames, and they're all getting better with their supplies. You know, a lot of them were running out of supplies early on. So I'm very hopeful that that's going to allow us to, by maybe end of first quarter next year, be able to open up some bit of inbound travel here to the US. I mean, it just, over the last 2 weeks, I've been on 7 different flight segments. And so what I do is I go to my local CVS here and get tested a couple of days before I travel. They're always pretty good about getting results back within 48 hours. And then I wait 2 or 3 days after I return home and I go get tested again. So I've been tested 8 times now over the last 5 months. And I'm just kind of managing that on my own personal responsibility. But those are the types of programs we need to have in place and be standardized for inbound travelers. So I know all the airlines are working with labs and test providers to get SLAs in place and have those types of procedures available to inbound travelers as well.
Really, really interesting. I'm not seeing any other questions right now in the chat box. So I want to tell everybody, if you do have questions for any of the panelists, please feel free to send them to my attention. That's lisa.simon@inboundtravel.org. And I'll be sure to pass them on. And when we post the recording, we can also put you in touch with each of the panelists if you have any questions at that time as well.
Yeah, if you haven't figured out, we all like to talk.
Well, we can pass on your contact information as well, Stu. Thank you all so much. I think that we have learned a lot today, and there's more to come. As you said, it's happening quickly, so maybe we can have these conversations, again, in the not too distant future. And thank you all so much for the work that you're doing to make travel safe and happening as quickly as possible.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye.